Hello, so tonight we are looking at The Difficulty of Kindness, Boundaries, Time, and the Ordinary by Clara Han. This appears in a collection of essays called The Ground Between Anthropologists Engage the Everyday. Engage Philosophy, excuse me. Okay, so this is a piece that comes out of many, many years of field work in Santiago de Chile, in particular, in a community called La Pincoya. And here she shows how the everyday is not just transparent, right? Everything does not exist just on the surface, visible, unproblematic, obvious. Uh, how does she show this? Well, that in the very acts and expression of care that cement and maintain social relations or comity, they can only do their work by remaining nebulous. Seems paradoxical. Maintaining a future together here depends on a certain kind of murkiness or a lack of transparency in the ordinary exercise of kindness. We're going to see then both why the everyday is not simply the given and taken for granted, but is often fragile, it's an achievement, and we can see how this particular community in La Pincoya undertakes to achieve the everyday or to achieve the ordinary. So, where is La Pincoya? Well, it's in Santiago de Chile, in the very northern part of the city, as she explains, right up against the hills at the northern edge of Santiago. She opens her essay with two provocative and enigmatic claims that it will take most of the paper to elaborate. One is that kindness and acknowledgement of hardship in La Pincoya rest on both attentiveness and forgetfulness, which seems contradictory, but she'll explain. And we'll see that this involves the exercise of pretending, of concealment of one's knowledge and one's motivations. Second, she notes that a goal of the essay is, as I said just a moment ago, to explore how we might think of the everyday as an achievement. That is, then, the everyday is not something um, that is simply a refuge from uncertainty or a refuge from hardship or paradox or crisis, but rather it is something that one or a community or a household achieves over and over again. The two strands of thinking are linked, though. We'll see that understanding the first, how kindness requires forms of benevolent dissimulation, reveals the second, not only how the everyday is an achievement, but what sorts of threats specific to La Pincoya may unravel it. So when I say benevolent dissimulation, what I'm getting at is that it's tempting to think of dissimulation or pretending or concealment of one's motives as a sort of some kind of devious, nefarious act, that it is malevolent. What we're going to find, though, is that, in fact, here dissimulation has a benevolent aspect to it. To provide herself and her readers with a clear vantage point, Han takes up a body of scholarship that is close to the topic of kindness, sort of an adjacent topic. We might call it a neighboring discourse, and that is critical work on humanitarian aid. The literature notes that aid takes the form of a gift that the recipient cannot reciprocate. So, what's this pointing toward? Well, we know from our own experiences of gift giving that when you give or receive a gift, you also give or receive an obligation. So that if someone gives you, say, a gift for your birthday, then implicit in that gift is some kind of reciprocal obligation to give a comparable kind of gift to that person on that person's birthday. And this is it's more complex even than that, right? So that we can think that the gift has to be roughly commensurate in whatever register you want to think of that. So let's say um, for my birthday, I receive, oh, I don't know, let's say a set of headphones. Okay, so 50 or 60 bucks, something like that. Now, if on the gift giver's birthday I reciprocate with a Mercedes Benz, well, that is a wildly disproportionate gift to give back. It signals that I don't understand what gift giving is about and that I don't have a good sense of how to reciprocate in kind. And so the person who receives that gift might find it completely disorienting, that it makes no sense to that person what I've done. But we can also think of this in terms of timing. So when I receive a gift for no particular reason, not a birthday or an anniversary or something like that, just because someone felt moved to give me a gift, then again, the obligation attaches that I'll reciprocate at some point, but the timing has to be right. If, let's say, I receive the gift and then I immediately hand over cash in roughly the value of the gift, then I've turned that into an exchange rather than a gift. And so the sense of intimacy, the sense of cementing a future together gets completely pulled out of the gift. I've turned it into an impersonal, anonymous exchange. By the same token, if I'm given the gift and I immediately give back something that is of comparable value, then the same effect. So timing matters. I also can't wait too late. If I give the gift a decade later, then there's a sense in which the moment has passed. The work of forging a future together has already been compromised. And so my sense of when to restore a gift or when to reciprocate with a gift rather is an important aspect of acknowledging that this is a gift, not just a financial exchange, that this has something to do with sustaining our relationship together, sustaining a future together, signaling uh, willingness and desire to go on into the future in with whatever degree of intimacy we have, and so forth. So then when the literature that we're looking at here on humanitarian aid makes the case that humanitarian aid appears as a gift that the recipient cannot reciprocate, because how would you, even if you had the resources in a moment of crisis, because of course that's where humanitarian aid shows up, to give back a gift to the one who bestowed aid upon you, how would you go about that? Do you send uh, what would it be? A baked good signaling your appreciation to the UN? It makes no sense, right? So that there are aspects of this um, gift giving that ensure that the recipient is always in a position of debt, that this is an obligation that the recipient can never exhaust. So, okay, so that the point here being that there are critiques of humanitarian aid that look to the structure of the gift implicit in humanitarian aid to level these charges against it. Her own work contrasts with this, so that when she looks at kindness, that she compares it to the politicization of compassion in the present. So the present moment of a crisis, let's say, that spurs humanitarian aid, that has this kind of anonymous quality to it, an anonymous institution giving aid to an anonymous mass of people who are suffering from that crisis, where it still has that gift quality to it, but it's badly compromised by the anonymity on either side. That's all about addressing the present crisis. Han wants to contrast that then with the form of kindness that she sees in La Pincoya, where it's a response not to the present, but to another's present. This is going to be an important distinction that she makes. And so it is, in doing this, organized around acknowledgement, acknowledging the specifics of another's present, and it's situated in everyday life, right? So these are ways in which the extension of kindness is not modeled on the humanitarian aid model of kindness, if you will. Kindness appears in Han's work in response to what she calls critical moments. So it's not that the notion of crisis has left the scene here, but that the specificity and scale of the crisis is going to be different. Critical moments are circumstances that occur within a larger scenario of precarious income, perpetual debt, and poverty. Why? Because credit is a fundamental aspect of how these households get by from month to month, or how they fail to get by from month to month if their debts get away from them. If the income that they're expecting doesn't materialize, or at least doesn't materialize in the volume that they're anticipating, then debt can overwhelm them. We'll see some examples of that. So that within that scenario, households can experience these moments of scarcity and crisis in ways that friends and neighbors might witness, and to which neighbors and friends may respond. That should be may respond, not might respond. Anyway, um, but that they'll do so differently. The ways that friends or kin and the way that neighbors, on the other hand, respond will be different. The expression of kindness will be different in the two cases. Extending kindness to neighbors, that's where it takes really delicate work. And this is in large part given the historic shift in Chile to insist on citizenship and its corresponding rights while simultaneously issuing charity. Why? Well, Han explains in her piece that there is a history in the development of modernity and the church around the 1800s and onward, where the church is responding to modernity and the social changes involved, in part objecting to what it sees as this kind of dislocation over the relationship between the wealthy and the poor, that it thinks of as this, um, let's say, codependent relationship. Because the poor, of course, provide labor, uh, whether it's agricultural labor or in the budding industries of the time, while the wealthy bestow charity through the church, and as she points out, these ancillary organizations that crop up around the church, charitable organizations, to give charity to the poor, right? But again, this is an awkward relationship. If we think back to the moment of that we were talking about the gift just now, we can see that the poor in this scenario are not, when they're receiving charity, they're not just receiving a certain kind of goods, but they're being placed in this position of ongoing obligation, debt. that just cements their position socially within the society. And the church has a certain interest in maintaining that. So the point being here that through this um, effort to maintain a particular kind of structure, it's also sustaining a certain notion of who is endowed with a certain kind of status and is in a position to bestow charity upon others, and who lacks that status and lacks dignity because they're the perpetual recipients of charity. And if not for charity, then they would not be able to make it. It's this position of abject dependence. But then there's a shift in, um, you can see it most clearly, perhaps, leading up to the election of Salvador Allende in 1973, I want to say. Um, in through the way that people, and in particular workers, she cites an example from a workers' organization, defend their position not as recipients of charity, but as citizens, and that citizenship rather has certain rights associated with it, so that when citizens make a claim on the state, they make it not as paupers, not as beggars, devoid or abject, and therefore devoid of dignity, but as citizens who possess dignity, and by making demands on the state are not foregoing their dignity in doing that, but laying claim to what they as citizens have a title. So it's a completely different relationship, in other words. This notion of dignity then is going to become central to understanding the dynamics of kindness in La Pincoya. Charity in this way became a target of resentment and hostility, in particular when the state started to attach conditions on, say, gaining access to some kind of social security, in which women would say have to make a pledge that they would start to become, as it were, responsible and use birth control and things like this, right? So that the conditions also positioned the recipients of state assistance as if they were not capable of managing their lives on their own, and they needed the state to step in and, like children, tell them how how they had to behave. In this way, then, there's a resistance to charity as degrading one's dignity, and as implying a certain level of disdain or devaluation of oneself as a recipient of charity. Friendship or neighborliness in La Pincoya demanded attentiveness, so being present, but acts of kindness between neighbors must also, therefore, not have just a whiff of charity to them, because any hint of charity would demonstrate inattentiveness to your neighbor's dignity. It would imply that the neighbor is in this abject position rather than being one who possesses dignity. Han poses this as a problem of boundaries. Shame, she says, shame which would attach to to receiving charity shadows the boundary between asking and begging. So she makes the point that the verb pedir in Spanish has these two connotations to it, that you can ask for something. So if I ask for a friend to give me a glass of water, then I'm just asking, right? But it's also clear how, in a moment of crisis, asking, say, for a neighbor for a cup of rice could take on this connotation not of asking, but of begging, right? And begging then is this companion to being a charity case. So then, um, in extending kindness, it's extremely important to maintain this boundary between asking and begging, or to um, carry out the giving of kindness with delicacy that is devoted to maintaining the boundaries that protect the recipient from shame. This will also be a way of preserving their future together. Anyway, we'll move on. Okay. It's important to note that this extension of kindness is not simply episodic, that is, organized around discrete events, but is reciprocal, that is, between friends or between kin. So this is something different from neighbors. If a a friend or a family member is going through a hard time, the kind of delicacy required between neighbors is not present in the same way. Why? Because you already have a certain level of intimacy, a certain level of knowledge and familiarity with the um, conditions of life that this friend or family member is experiencing. And so, and you're probably already engaged in this kind of serial exchange of gifts, of favors, and so on, so that there's a way that you can extend kindness or help to somebody who's a friend or a member of your kin that you can give with the recognition that this is just another entry in the reciprocal relation of giving help, gifts, favors to one another. The template is already laid out there, in other words. So this is a distinct kind of giving in that it unfolds over time, right? The notion of reciprocation is one that unfolds over time. The tempo of it is an important aspect of it. And so it can, in that case, it's not attached to a single episode, but is rather something that occurs within the constant unfolding of the relationship that extends forward in time. Well, it extends forward and backward in time. Now, Han goes on to say, through acts of reciprocity that constantly stabilize a woman's enduring, critical moments are quietly contended with and contained among kin and friends, shoring up moral boundaries when faced with hardships, corrosive potential. So things get a bit tricky though. Um, Kindness as reciprocal in nature sounds like there's this serial quality to it. Why, as I was saying, reciprocation unfolds over time. With when we get to neighbors, though, things are different. It doesn't have this reciprocal quality because that would imply at the first extension of giving that would imply that one the recipient also takes on this kind of obligation or debt. There's an acknowledgement or recognition even that this person is in a moment of need. That's going to compromise that person's dignity. So then, to contrast with the kind of giving that you get among family and friends, Han introduces this notion of vertical time. What she says is a co-occurring or contemporaneous acts, moments, and circumstances involved in kindness between neighbors. Kindness works through simultaneous attentiveness and forgetfulness. So, attentiveness to the circumstances that the household or the individual is experiencing, but also a forgetfulness that they are experiencing that, and a forgetfulness that you're extending kindness in the first place, that you're not, therefore, extending kindness in anticipation of reciprocation in the future. That means then that attentiveness and forgetfulness are not happening one after the other, but are happening simultaneously, layered together or lining one another. These are the ways that she describes it. Having said this, kindness does not occur only in vertical time, and how one reacts to catching another's critical moment both responds to and constitutes the sort of relationship you have with that person. So again, this is the kind of distinction that you're going to get between friend and kin on the one side and neighbor on the other. A neighbor may catch a critical moment, but not respond as a friend would. That is to say, not with this notion of reciprocal unfolding over time extension of kindness, but rather this kind of um, vertical time. So she explains the crucial difference between inhabiting friendship and neighborliness lay not in the perceptive activity of catching those signs of critical moments, so that you can catch a sign among friends, you can catch a sign among neighbors. So that's not the distinction, that ability to perceive. She says, but rather in how that catching would or could be addressed. In friendship, asking and giving occur in a modality of reciprocity, of mutual obligations that carry a relation forward in time and in which personal intimacies are shared. On the one side, then, there's the desire to endure, to meet life's hardships with dignity, yet signs of that hardship still seep out. She says, a child's cry from hunger, the visit from a debt collector, the electricity cut, a domestic fight over bills spills out into the street. Critical moments, then, may not remain private despite a household's best efforts, and neighbors may be made aware of your need for help, as of course may be friends and family. Responding to the seepage one catches as a neighbor or friend requires a deft touch. Performing an act of kindness requires that you conceal both the critical moment that you've witnessed in the case of a neighbor and the act of giving you have undertaken in response. Again, that will be different with friends and kin, but among neighbors, this concealment is central. So in this case, there's no room for the grand gesture, right? Like you can't make a spectacle of your kindness. Acts of kindness have to be both meaningfully helpful, right? Like they need to address the crisis in question or some aspect of the crisis in question, but they also have to be quotidian or just ordinary enough to appear unexceptional. So then sharing food, helping with sewing, picking children up from school, all of these things are examples that Han gives, acknowledging hardship or need without directing attention to it. In fact, scrupulously not directing attention to it. The tact and delicacy of the acts of kindness Han describes signal the seriousness with which people in La Pincoya treat others' critical moments, and Han points out, give us insight into the kinds of threats critical moments pose to everyday life. And this is important. This is a step in understanding why she's going to present everyday life as an achievement. Why? Because it is perpetually exposed to these kinds of threats. Not just these kinds of threats, other kinds as well, but these are the kinds that she's talking about. First, though, Han directs her attention to the ways that J.L. Austin's essay Pretending can give depth to understanding of the gifts she has described. To begin, it draws her attention to this notion of vertical time or co-occurrence of acts in the gift. So here we have J.L. Austin. He says, I must be trying, when he's talking about pretending, I must be trying to make others believe or give them the impression by means of personal performance in their presence that I am really only so forth ABC in order to disguise the fact that I am really XYZ. And then he goes on to capture the principle concisely. He says, in pretending, contemporary behavior misleads as to contemporary fact. So we can see this notion of vertical time here, where my behavior in this moment misleads as to the fact in this moment of what I'm actually doing. So he could give an example of appearing to wash a window when in fact, so that's the contemporary behavior, when the contemporary fact or the simultaneous fact, if you wish, is that he's casing the joint to see if there's anything to steal, right? So that it's pretending in that sense of simultaneity. Han explains. Features of pretending that Austin emphasizes include being in one another's presence, right? So pretending has to be done in the presence of the one who you wish to mislead. Presence and present, right? That it happens now. So we can think of this then as pretender and audience, present in each other's presence, and contemporaneous appearing as. So this notion of dissimulation, while in fact being something else, concealed, so that what you're actually doing is concealed by the pretense of what you're doing, the pretending. Rather than the tempo of gift and counter gift, right, these things that unfold over time, there's an act that is the concealment of another. So they are synchronous, simultaneous, happening at one and the same time. Following from this, Han raises the question of what work the concealment in pretending might protect or permit in everyday life. So then, if we think of this in terms of threats, right, the threat that exists within everyday life is the threat to living with dignity. And overt recognition of one's crisis undermines one's dignity, right? So that and that will affect one's position in the community. She turns to the notion of gossip, for example, to explore how it is that one's standing in a community can be badly degraded by gossip if you are seen to be asking for things, again, pedir, in a way that shades into begging. And so yes, this can have consequences for your relations within a community. Um, so we should recall that what is concealed is not only the giving, but also the neighbor's catching of the critical moment. So that the neighbor who catches the critical moment that's going on in another's household, let's say household, it could happen elsewhere, but let's just say household. That person who's doing the catching needs to conceal not only that that individual, she's talking mostly about women here, so let's say um, that it's not only that she's concealing her catching the critical moment, her awareness that something is going on, a critical moment in this household, but then also is concealing that the giving that she does in response to catching the critical moment, that too is concealed. Why? Because concealing allows for the enduring to endure. It allows for um, the woman who is experiencing the critical moment, for whom this notion of bearing up under hardship is central to maintaining dignity. It allows her to maintain this um, enduring character. An important effect of taking pretending seriously for Han is that it allows us to shift our attention from a picture of the poor as perpetually struggling for recognition in a world of hierarchical identities and towards the subtle work of understated kindness with its currents of remembering and forgetting directed at support the support of one another's dignity. Finally, pretending reveals the moral energy in remaining silent about how and when one cares for others. Words here then can have a devastating revelatory potential. If you're careless with your words, then you can reveal your knowledge of the other's critical moment, of the degradation that that individual may be potentially experiencing. And so that has all of the devastating consequences that go along with um, being exposed, shamed for the crisis that one is experiencing. Why? Because it becomes public in that way. So remaining alert to the potential for pretending to shroud a critical moment in an enabling silence redirects our attention to the almost imperceptible, quiet moral striving of acts of kindness that present themselves as something else. What Han points to here is that getting a handle on what's going on in Lapinkoya as these women and their families experience critical moments doesn't come from escaping the particularities of the everyday in order to develop like this 30,000-foot description, but rather from delving deeper into the everyday. The kind of notion that one like Veena Das is also very enthusiastic about promoting. A feature of sociality that has been in the background throughout Han's paper now comes into focus. Making the other present to me and myself present to the other depends upon acknowledging our separateness. To fail to or decline to acknowledge our separateness is to render the other as a fictitious character, a figment of one's own imagination that necessarily denies the other's own sense of self, own sense of autonomy, and so forth. It is, in a sense, a way of denigrating the other. In so Han doesn't cite this piece, but she does cite Merleau-Ponty, several pieces by Merleau-Ponty. Uh, but I want to turn to the phenomenology of perception to get at some of the points that she's making here. So, phenomenology of perception is his masterwork in phenomenology. Um, so, in it, as well as in the essays that Han cites, Merleau-Ponty argues that the subject does not possess, but is possessed by objects. That seems like a completely counterintuitive way of thinking about subjectivity. But this is the case that he makes. That if we think of a sonata, a violin sonata, say, if we think of the musician as possessing the sonata, we're not getting from Merleau-Ponty what it is to be a musician. Rather, the sonata possesses the musician. It allows the individual to become a particular kind of subject, musician. That's how subjectivity becomes constituted in this view. So that you don't arrive on the scene as a fully formed subject and then possess the sonata. Rather, in the playing of the sonata possesses you in a way that makes you into this kind of subject, a musician. We can see how then this applies to the self and the other. Just as we are not subjects first who may, as subject, possess or appropriate objects, but rather we are subjects by virtue of the way that objects possess us, it's the same way with others. Uh, I don't arrive on the scene as a standalone subject who apprehends a standalone other. Rather, it's only by virtue of the other that I'm a subject. In Lapinkoya, we can see this in that one is not responsive because one is a friend, a certain kind of subject first, friend, who then behaves according to that subjectivity. Rather, one is a friend because of one's responsiveness. Similarly, one is a neighbor as distinct from being friend by responding in a different way to having caught another's critical moment and responded to it or not. That is how one becomes a specific kind of subject. And my hope is that it's clear why this kind of insight is valuable for anthropology, that the specificity of one's subjectivity arises from one's social connection, one's social position with respect to others. Okay, moving on then. Hopefully, this sharpens our sense of what's at stake in the relations Han describes. Responsiveness and deftly handled kindness that preserves both another's dignity and relieves the pressure of a critical moment make up one possible set of reactions. Withholding these things, as the example of Isabel uh, demonstrates, is another. So in the piece, some friends of Hans are talking about this woman, Isabel. There's a phenomenon called, or maybe an institution is a better way to put it, called pollas, right? In a polla, all these women will contribute a certain amount to a collective pot, and at specified intervals, let's say every month, one woman will get the entirety of that pot to do whatever it is that she needs to do with it. And then everybody continues contributing to the pot so that the next time another woman gets the polla in order to do what she wants. Now, Isabel developed a reputation. Why? Because she participated in a number of pollas, being happy to take them when her turn came up, but not contributing to them. And so the result of this was, as her reputation developed, then shops would find that they were no longer willing to extend credit to her, so that she couldn't, if she didn't have cash on hand, which is the position that many households are in, um, in particular if they're getting close to a payday but have not yet reached that day, then uh, if she can't buy things on credit and she hasn't got cash, then she can't buy those things. And how did this come about? It came about because the community started to see her in a particular light as one who's not going to make good on her debts, who's not going to who's going to take but not give in the way that she's supposed to, in the proportions that she's supposed to. And so ultimately then Isabel becomes essentially shunned within the community and winds up having to leave. We don't know where she went. That um, Han's friends don't know that part of the story. They just know that she had to leave. She couldn't make a go of it in La Pincoya any longer. So that in this is a case of withholding responsiveness, that it entails a kind of denial of the reality of others, as if their critical moments are not real for me, not mine to respond to with kindness. So that in the case of Isabel, because of the particular kind of relationships she built up, these bad relationships, she became, instead of the recipient of kindness, the target of gossip. And that this made her life in La Pincoya unviable. To put it in the kind of language that I've been trying to use and that I think Han uses, that her future in that community became impossible. So here's how Han characterizes the social world she's analyzed. She says, It is a world in which a preoccupation with limits may be emphasizing not the integrity of identity as sovereign self, but rather the problems of responsiveness within and across the self's relational modes, right? Because the self can be constituted in these different ways as friend, as family, as neighbor who may become friend. These are different ways of constituting the self that are built around one's relation to others. In this world, kindness cannot be taken as just as given, as expected, because of the uncertainty around what constitutes a critical moment. Like, I'm hearing a child crying next door. Is the child crying because it hasn't eaten all day, or is it some other less critical reason? It can be hard to tell. So I'm not always sure if what I'm catching is a critical moment, or if another's actions occur in response to my critical moment, because kindness must be disguised in any case, right? So that it's not the whole point is that among neighbors, kindness not appear as kindness, that it appears as just regular old run of the mill activities or practices. So that Han tells a story of a friend who becomes aware that a neighbor is in a desperate situation and is essentially out of money and out of food. And so she just happens by this neighbor's place with Han as well, um, and inquires, "So have you had lunch yet?" And the neighbor says no, not surprisingly, because there's no food to make lunch anyway. And she says, "Oh well, look, I made too much food. Send your boy around if you don't mind to help me out with that food. Just give me. I've got a few things to get done first, so just send him around in a little while, and he can help me out with this extra food that I've got." Now, Hen and this friend get back home, and there Hen realizes that actually this friend has not made anything yet. So the other things that she has to take care of turn out to be making spaghetti with a tomato and hot dog sauce. And and so she makes this big pot so that the neighbor's son can come over, eat this food, and have lunch that day. Right? So this is something then, this is pretending, this is concealment, right? That the act of kindness must be undetectable as an act of kindness. Um, but on the other hand, that's not the only possible outcome. It may be that the one who catches the critical moment is not in a position to extend kindness at that time, right? It may be that that individual simply doesn't have the resources, maybe doesn't have, to take this example, the extra food to offer at that time. Or there could be other reasons as well. So that these things are not to be taken for granted. They're not automatic. They're not fated to happen. They're contingent. They might happen. They might not. It depends on a myriad of um, other kinds of factors, other kinds of contingencies. If the everyday becomes visible to us, then in the threats to it, right? Like this is how we come to appreciate what constitutes everyday life. We can see everyday life more clearly when we think about what stands as a threat to it and our reaction to those threats as well. What can we take from Han's paper to help us think about the everyday? She says, between neighbors, there's a double sense to kindness. Just as those critical moments are concealed within a domestic scene, kindness is concealed by pretending. It occurs through achieving a likeness to everyday life while responding to it. The nature of kindness is therefore thoroughly entwined with boundaries in this world between friend and neighbor, home and the street, that inform the small but significant slip from asking to begging. But it is just as intertwined with engaging those boundaries, shoring them up by subtly overcoming them in the face of another's critical moments. Taking another's vulnerability as mine to respond to, with all the delicacy such a response demands, is a deeply ethical move, and one that reveals both how threats or vulnerabilities arise within the everyday, but the resources, perhaps the practical, but certainly the ethical resources, are also available within the everyday. That is, it's not that these sorts of resources exist somewhere outside of everyday life, that they are already present within the everyday if they are present anywhere at all. So indeed, we see in La Pincoya that an effort to escape the everyday as a way of coping with others' critical moments would be to deny them as one's others, a sort of abandonment with enormous destructive potential. So what do I mean by one's others? Well, I think what Hannah's pointing out to here is that others become my others when I catch their critical moments. It's not the only way, but it's the way that's relevant here. And so when I catch a critical moment, if that calls me to respond as an issue that is ethical in nature, then that is what it is for another to be my other. This is all that I'm getting at with that. So that if I'm to have a future with others, in a sense, they have to be my others and I have to be their other in sort of in tandem, right? And that is all that I have to say on this piece. Uh, Thank you very much. And that's it. Fin. Done.